Welcome to the 2-Month Review, a weekly podcast in which we break down a single book over a 2-month period. And right now, we are reading Tómas Jónsson, Bestseller by Gudbjörg Bergson, which is referred to frequently as the Icelandic Ulysses. We've been digging into it for a number of weeks. And this week, we will be discussing the second half of the 10th composition book, pages 238 through 281. And by we, I mean myself, Chad Post from Open Letter Books, Lytton Smith, who's on the line, who is the translator of Tómas Jónsson, also professor, a poet, overall great person. And then joining us this week is Patrick Smith, who is on the Best Translated Book Award judging panel for fiction this year, and has done so in the past. Was a former intern at Open Letter, is all around a literary person, works with the Scofield, works with Asymptote, and is generally like a reviewer and reader and person very knowledgeable about international literature. So thanks for joining us, Patrick.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
And former mailman.
Yes, and currently looking for a job.
So if you're listening to this and you want to hire Patrick, you should. Before we get into this, I'm going to make a special announcement since we just figured this out, and since this episode will be going up, unfortunately, just a few days before this is taking place. But on September 30th, we will be recording the last episode of this season. We'll record on September 30th, but it'll go live on October 12th, and we'll cover the rest of the book, the whole book. And we're going to be recording that live, actually, at Spoonville and Sugartown in Brooklyn on Saturday, September 30th from 3 till 5 p.m., and that is right? 3 to 5?
3 to 5.
3 to 5. We will, at 2 p.m., the First Lady of Iceland, Eliza Reid, will give a reading/talk, and then we will take over right after she finishes. And from 3 to 4, we'll do the podcast, and then from 4 to 5, there'll be a grand reception sponsored by the Icelandic consulate. So the First Lady of Iceland is our warm-up act, as you pointed out. Which is kind of amazing. But anyone who wants to come, it's free. It's there. They said that they will have alcohol. They're going to advertise it. You just have to get yourself to Spoonville and Sugartown out in Brooklyn. It's a great store. It's a great place. And it will be really fun to do one of these live and in person, especially covering the whole last part of the book. All works out perfectly, and it's part of Iceland Days. So if you're listening, if you're interested, if you're in New York, come by, see us. You could ask, we could take questions from the audience. We'll figure it all out. And we'll be posting more information about it online in the build-up. But since this is the one of the last episodes to come out before that will be recorded, I wanted to mention it now. Anyways, okay.
Yeah, we're super excited.
Yeah, I'm super excited. It's so crazy. It seems super crazy
Right.
to do anything live like that, but much less to have the First Lady of Iceland being there as well. So anyways, Patrick, how did you get involved in reading international literature in the first place?
God, probably Haruki Murakami, which is why, like, as much as I don't care for him now, I still have a defensiveness of him.
Which
in
book?
college, what?
Which book particularly?
Oh God, I don't even remember.
I mean, like, which ones are you most defensive of?
Oh, I'm just defensive of him being like somewhat worth reading. I guess Kafka on the Shore. I mean, I haven't read any of his newer stuff, so older stuff is what appealed to me. I think the first thing I read may have been his short story collection, Elephant Vanishes.
Oh, okay.
So I just started reading him in college, kind of just as a college dude, seemed like a good choice. And then after liking him, I started just to read a lot of other Japanese literature. I turned to Kobo Abe a lot after that. And then I've read almost only translated Japanese literature for about a year. And at some point, I realized that most of what I was reading was translation. And then that kind of spiraled, and I started finding resources online and reviewers online and like publishers like you. And then just it kept on going. I didn't really turn away from it at any point, and it just got deeper into it.
Is your email address a specific reference to Bolaños 2666?
Yes, again, college dude who's reading kind of cliche college books when that came out. I had graduated when that came out, but I was still on that college dude literature kick. And when I made that email, the only people I was emailing with, weren't literature people, and so they had no idea what it was. And now it's just like this continual embarrassment over my head as I interact with more and more translated literature people.
Yeah, once you sign up for that name, there's no going back.
There's no going back. And if anyone looks at it, they probably think I'm like still obsessed with that book. And it's a great book. I love it. But I would not choose that for my email. I mean, I needed numbers on my email address. I wanted to be PT Smith, needed numbers, and went with that and have regretted it. Not, since, but, after about a year of having it, I regretted it.
Wow. Hey, it makes sense, though. I mean, it must be hard for you guys there's so many Smiths on this podcast, which is weird. But Smiths are got to be hard to get. Well, Lytton, you must be able to get your normal name for most things.
Yeah, for most things. Although there's like 3 Lytton Smiths in the country, and every now and then somebody will mistake one of us for the other. And
that's awesome.
There's a guy who's out on the West Coast, and I guess must be involved with the archery scene, because the other week I got an email asking me about some times of some archery events the next day.
Wow.
So I'm considering taking up archery just to try and
you should just to
right.
more confusion.
Yeah.
You have a friend already.
Right, exactly. Someone teach me the ropes.
Exactly. So what about the Scofield? Do you want to tell us a little bit about that for anyone who's not familiar with it?
Yeah, so the Scofield's an online journal. It's twice a year, and each issue focuses on a single artist that we think is under-recognized or just hasn't been written about extensively the way they kind of deserve to be. And then there's just a theme that the editors feel is in their work in some way, and then people write pieces that are either about the writer or they're about the theme, and they can be very direct, they can be tangential, and it's huge. I mean, the idea is that if you want to know more about these authors, then the Scofield becomes kind of a go-to resource. There'll be interviews, sometimes with the author if they're still living, other times with people related to them. And I got started with them. On their first issue, they invited me to just write a review of, because they include 1 or 2 reviews per issue of just another work. Usually like something contemporary that is coming out or recently came out. And I wrote a review for them, and then shortly after that, they needed design assistance, and so I joined in then and helped out the original designer for them. And now, since he's left, I do all of the layout and that stuff for each issue. The next issue is on Kobo Abe, which is fitting for me because, as I said, that's kind of one of my first steps after Murakami and translated literature. And I'm looking forward to it. I'm waiting for the final pieces so I can do the layout for them, and then the final editing will happen, and then the issue will come out. And I interviewed the translator of a recent Abe book that had previously been not translated, Beast's Head for Home.
Yeah.
It's one of his early works, and it's interesting as an early work. I enjoyed it.
So you know how we were having, this is insider info, but I'm just going to tell everyone anyways, we were having problems getting Patrick a review copy of that book when he was interning at the press because Columbia had sent one to us, and I wanted to read that, so I was hoarding it. And it was what we would refer to as the check copy, so that when you turn in a review, you can double check that you didn't fuck up the quotes, right?
Right.
So you have to have that one here anyways. And they were supposed to send another one, and they didn't. We got 3 copies in 2 days last week. So I have a plethora of Kobo Abe books now.
I'm glad you have it.
One thing about the Scofield, though, it reminds me a lot of what the review for contemporary fiction was back, that was published by Delkey Archive, which was the start of Delkey Archive in 1980, I believe. And it was like a magazine designed to be covering. It came out 3 times a year, and it covered generally one author, sometimes 2 authors, frequently 2 authors, I think. And it would be a series of essays about those authors who were like underappreciated or didn't have enough critical work written about them to be able to be the focus of someone's study in like a PhD level, right? So like before, like William Gaddis was written about all the time, they did William Gaddis issues so that people could then study William Gaddis and therefore get that ball rolling. Other than that, it looks like, according to their website, that the last issue of RCF came out in the fall of 2014 and was a Moldovan literature issue. which is whatever. That's cool. But so it's gone. It seems to be permanently gone. So it's good that there's something else that's kind of picking up that sort of line of criticism.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be involved. It's a great project. It's I enjoy it.
And you're a big Icelandic fan, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of cliche, but yeah, I am. I've visited twice, and I try to read what exists in translation when I can.
Any favorite authors?
I mean, I love Laxness. I really do, and I love the writers that you guys have published a lot. They're funny. I like to go for humor in books, and I insist that there is humor in Laxness, although not always.
Yeah. I finally finished Independent People, and I think it's fine. It's not my favorite thing, but I get it. It's fine. It reminds me a lot of Middlemarch.
Mm.
I love that that's your proclamation on a Nobel laureate, Chad. It's fine.
It's fine. It's not,
I can take it or leave it.
There's that old Louis C.K. bit where he's at IKEA with this woman. She's like, "What about this rug?" He's like, "I don't know, it's fine." She's like, "What do you mean it's fine?" He's like, "I know, it didn't give me AIDS. It didn't make me come. What do you expect me to say?" Anyways, with that, we should start talking about Hitler. Let's make offensive jokes and then go right into Hitler. So this section picks up where we left off last week, where we talked to David about those various crazy stories that Tómas is sort of making up about. They're sort of mythical or whatever about Anna and Katrine and the various women in his life. And this section that we're talking about starts with a long folktale called the Soprano Katrine Jansdottir, in which Katrine is a very famous singer between World War I and World War II. Is famous all over the world, goes to Germany, and where Hitler falls in love with her. And then I'm going to let you take this away, Patrick, since this is your favorite section. And
thanks for just setting that one up.
You picked this immediately. When we asked you to be on the show, you said, "Can I do this section?"
Yes, and like many things in my life, I almost immediately began to think I regretted it. So I would say Hitler becomes obsessed with her. I think putting love onto it is kind.
Yeah. Obsessed is much better.
He wants to have her, and they meet at sea by I forget who arranges it. One of the other Nazis, Göring. Yeah. And I mean, he has her over for dinner, and at first it's going well.
They talk about art.
They talk about art, and Hitler starts to get drunk and be a total fool, and then he makes his move. She doesn't want to, and then he attempts to rape her, and in the process comes his pants, which amuses me a lot. In a very complicated way. I think one of the things about this book is that there is some humor in it that is just bawdy and funny and playful. And I think there's some humor that is very dark and has serious sides to it that become kind of complicated. And this is definitely one of them. It is... Well, the follow-up is that because of his drunken humiliation, because of how it goes, that's basically what causes Hitler to start World War II.
Right.
Which makes him utterly pathetic, which is an interesting way of just attempting to take power away from him. But at the same time, Tómas kind of sides with him. He makes him so pathetic that it makes him and Tómas similar. Here's the line. By nature, Hitler was not bad so much as sensitive and stubborn. And
yeah, that's a dangerous line.
Yeah, but I mean Tómas isn't a narrator that you are supposed to totally align yourself with. Although at times you do. He says things you agree with. He says things that are vile. and trying to parse out which is happening when. And there's times that something he says is vile, and you're like, I agree with a less vile version of that.
That section, just to interrupt for a second, that section goes on too. I have that whole part underlined. By nature, Hitler was not bad so much as sensitive and stubborn. What he took upon himself had to stand unaltered, and he never compromised on anything. In short, he was a product of the time. Which also seems to be a recurring theme in here of like this sort of like the environmental constructs of like how people act or what is happening or what is acceptable at that moment.
Yeah. And I mean, that's Thomas himself, is that Thomas sees himself as someone stubborn. And there's the complication of, did Thomas rape the girl in his house or not? And so he's both making Hitler utterly pathetic as a way to humiliate him, but also then defending him and aligning himself with him. Trying to parse out what he's doing there and why, and then what Guthberger's doing versus what Thomas is doing. It's interesting and it's dangerous, but it's I like that. I like that it's a very dangerous humor that you have to work with to make okay, rather than just laughing at the idea of the scene.
Yeah, and I think there's so many layers to this as well, and this is why I think it's such an important book, because obviously we're talking about all of this, and it in the wake of Americans having to sort of find themselves in a strange position of having to protest Nazis, right? And it's a really strange moment to be, it was a strange moment to be translating this book, a strange moment to be reading this book, and in some senses it can feel comforting to have, basically, Hitler reduced to this sort of pathetic male figure who can't interact with women, and therefore, it becomes dangerous, and to have that narrative laid bare. But then there's also the way that Thomas Guthberger is nesting this whole thing in the fact that, like, Olaf is the one who tells. So this is a story that's told at this sort of table in the refectory, the board, and Olaf is the one who tells it. And Olaf, we've sort of seen, is this, very dubious character who Thomas, quibbles with. And then you've got Miss Gerther explicitly saying, I've often heard this story, I somehow never believed it, which is, of course, because it's complete fabrication. And so, I think you've got these layers, and also this sense that, like, there's this really interesting reference here, which is impossible to get in translation, but one of the things that Hitler does is he sends the first corpse of the war to Catherine, and it's described in the Icelandic as a symbol of victory and a shame pole. Now, the Icelandic word for that is nidstone, and the shame pole had a very specific function within medieval Icelandic culture, which is it was something that you would put up to taunt your enemies. It would often be, the head of somebody you'd killed, but also to sort of remind of your strength. And so you've got this, like, again, Guthberger sort of digging back into a past, and he's pointing out the problem, which, it's a problem that Nazi belief has, is it's sort of this infatuation with a version of the Icelandic past, right? And this mythologizing the past being really, really dangerous and really, really uncomfortable.
That's true. And there's one other part that's interesting to me, too, that comes up in here, is the way that it's positioning Katrine as an Icelander being responsible for World War II, and sort of inserting Iceland into, like, a critical moment in 20th century history, where not only does she, like, start the war because of this event, but then also, like, when she's singing in London and she loses her vocal cord pops is the same time that the war ends, and that, like, Iceland's sort of like a crucial stage of this, which is sort of not exactly true, but is creating that kind of myth and that sort of idea of this kind of mythic nature of Iceland.
Sorry, Patrick. It's not a conversation I've had with Icelanders directly, but the impression I get is that there is some guilt for people of that generation about the way that the Nazis were reliant on, particularly Norse and Icelandic mythology. And for years, I mean, I've been translating another book, a fabulous novel called Refi, which Deep Vellum is putting out next year. And in that book, there's this whole discussion of how the central character can't really study sort of Icelandic studies because of the shadow of what the Nazis did to them.
Well, added in that is that Iceland was neutral during the war, and that's like when they broke from Denmark, which they used that time period to do things for themselves as opposed to be involved. And I think there's a sense of guilt if you were neutral during World War II, because that was kind of easy time to pick a side.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very true. There's, I don't have anything else to add to that particular section, but I think then things get really interesting too, because we go into the next part where there's a little bit about like how invalids are taken care of and are kind of the best. It's better to be just an invalid in Iceland because everything will be taken care of. If these people get too lazy to breed, they are pushed into it with grants for intercourse. The state pays for every child produced. All this kind of like nationalist building again, and a whole bit about like creating more Icelanders. So there's even like the statement about like who's it from? It's the National Congress of Icelandic Women encouraging everyone to get busy. So that they could get to 200,000 inhabitants by the year 2000. And then that's followed by this satirical bit about a ministry meeting of the government of Iceland where they're going to name the 2000th inhabitant what is it called? What is it? The favorite son?
Right, Iceland's favorite child. Yeah, and the you know, and this 200,000 inhabitant, one of the ironies is that they get rewarded with flights to Copenhagen, which is like, you become the 200,000th Icelander, and therefore you have to go back to Denmark, right? and that's the colonial history repeating itself. So it's, everything in this book is sort of heavily ironized.
Yeah, I love too that it says honor title Iceland's favorite child, both in official documents and in daily use. So all that happens. So there's this like bit of nationalist building, and then comes the long section of Asmundur Steinson's story, which I think is like fascinating, and I'm not entirely sure what to make of it as a whole. But I'll just try and summarize it first of all. So Asmundur, the main story is that he loses his hand and a toe. And then there's a bunch of ideas about why he lost his hand and his toe, or how he lost them. Then that's kind of merged into a story of him being involved with this woman who he falls in love with, and they get married, and they're living in his house, and then she gets involved with his bad, nasty, deceitful brother who steals her away from Asmundur, and they go run off and have an affair, and Asmundur's left, like, literally eating his home, because he's given it kind of merges the idea of like how whatever the value of his house is, paying for his food becomes just him eating his house. Slowly but surely, he's eating the top floor. Now he's eating down the stairwell. That's his life. And that feels like, and Thomas equates himself with Asmundur at least at one point, and is like, oh, this I don't like to tell other people's stories, but like, he sort of reminds me of me. Asmundur had his residence on the site of the refectories, perhaps former location, on the second floor. I am familiar with his life history, which is fairly similar to, or could be like, mine, if I continue to ignore the value of housing and property. So that's a really interesting section, too, where you've got, like, coming right on the heels of this kind of nationalist, the Nazi part, that sort of guilt and weirdness, and then wanting to create, like, a larger number of inhabitants, followed by like some of the bad things that happen out of that. There's first the socialist part where it's like, we will provide for everyone, invalids, that all seems good, and then you end up with like this weird bit where like people are losing their house, having to eat their house.
And page 273 it was almost for me like the key page in the book as I was translating it, where we got these sort of math problems, right? Yeah. And Asmundur has a 3-story house, 100 square meters in size, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the questions are things like, how long does it take him to eat each story? If the upper story is valued at 200,000 krona, the second floor at 300,000 krona, and the basement apartment at 150,000 krona. And again, you get this sense that like different levels of Icelandic houses are worth different amounts of money, and therefore being in the basement is the lowest status, and he's slowly going to be moving between these stories. And again, it's the book trying to work out the problem of like, he's seen as a communist because he's eating away his own property rights. This is Olaf's view of Asmundur, and so it is this sort of like capitalism versus communism, sort of trying to play out that whole debate throughout the period of the book.
With that section, it was also, much of the narrative becomes, you guys have talked about how disjointed it becomes and how eccentric it becomes, but then he also has these moments like that where he gets very, very detailed and makes everything concrete, even while it's existing in this like completely unsettled concept of eating a home. He's taking the time to make it very, very detailed and try to control it.
I think that's one of the one of the things that I love most about this book is the way that, like, there are moments when you just have to sort of go with it and sort of think, what is going on here? And then other moments where there's this level of clarity. And I think you're so right, Patrick, that it's clarity about something really weird. Yes. Like he's made physical the metaphor of eating yourself out of house and home, but in a way that makes that metaphor seem really strange, because it's what you eat takes away from your house, even though you're not actually eating the house. And yet the detail is there, and you can just hang on to that for a bit, and then the book's going to accelerate away in other weird directions.
Yeah, absolutely it will. I have a question specifically within this as a translation one, and this is maybe relates to like when Scott Esposito was on and was asking about the proofreading and the questions with that. And this is one where I just absolutely trusted in you. Is on page 269. There is a part where Aswinder's brother, whose name is something Marcus. Is it Marcus? Yeah, Marcus is talking to Fia, Aswinder's wife, and he keeps saying things like, "Well, I'm probably too sensitive. He cannot stand to see her in daylight." And those are italicized, the he and her. Throughout the rest of that page, there's a lot of he's and hers and she's and hims that are all italicized. And I'm not sure why that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, for me, I was reading it the whole time as the way that, like, people are in this book are always becoming symbols or archetypes, right? That they sort of cease to be individuals and they become this, like, idea, and then they become this ideal, right? That so the way that Tómas sees himself as kind of Ásmundur, and I mean, maybe one of the lessons of this book is that, like, it's not saying we shouldn't be reading history and we shouldn't be telling these stories, but it is saying that there's a real importance to taking stock of the present moment and sort of having a kind of flexibility alongside that knowledge of history. And so I think for me, that's what the italics were doing. I don't know if that's what Gutenberg was intending.
Huh. That makes a lot of sense, though. And I like that. I like that reading where it becomes a little bit universal, too.
Yeah, and I think it is a book about this sense of, of becoming universal, and the dangers of that, right? I mean, and what is the Nazi mission except an attempt to make one thing that's particular to one group of people universal to everybody, right? And that's why, among other things, it's so dangerous.
Absolutely. You're still there, right, Patrick?
Yep.
Okay, you went quiet for a second. I thought maybe you were
stunned into silence.
I just had no thoughts.
Okay.
or no intelligent thoughts.
Fair enough. There's I don't know if there's anything else with the Asmundur section, although I like that one. I like the part where he gets in the fight with the woman and she like judo moves him. He spills her milk gin and she's like, give me a new drink, and he's like, no, fuck you, and she's like, okay, I'm gonna kick your ass. He's like, whatever, and then she like judo moves like rips his hand off essentially.
Right, and I think again, like structurally, like the book is really cleverly written in that, like, there are these deliberate parallels with like the Hitler Goering Katrine, right? You've got two men and a woman, right? You've then got Asmundur and his brother and Fia, so you've got two men and a woman, and slightly different things are happening. But the word sensitive is used of Marcus at one point, and so like. It's almost as if these stories are sort of playing out like, let's look at these situations and see sort of the different outcomes that can happen. But, it was impossible not to translate it without just sort of feeling really bleak about masculinity, right? Not about men, but about the idea of masculinity. And it's no surprise that we end this chapter with this man who's just completely psychotic and this, like farcical, episode with the chicken, right? Yep. And you're thinking, well, even as there's a bit of humor coming in there, after everything we've read, you just sort of end up despairing, of the role that men are playing, because of their buying into certain ideas of masculinity in all of these things.
I don't think you can play with this type of humor without ending it by undermining the masculinity that's causing the humor. I think if you just play it straight, then it's just disgusting.
Yeah.
It's the constant undermining of these people that makes it work. The obsession over his hand is playful, and I love that. Like, I guess as I'm going back, I'm failing to find examples, but I'm like, there's other times that someone in a book becomes obsessed over making their perfect fake hand, and I've enjoyed that. So, like the singeing to make it to try to mimic what he had before is desperate, and it's interesting.
Yeah, we haven't talked about. I don't think we've talked about in the podcast that the ways in which there's a sort of quasi Moby Dick thing going on where. You've got these sort of like totalitarian Ahab figures, and maybe Thomas is one himself, and he starts off the book building this device to put on his nose, and now he's really interested in these fake hands, which kind of remind you of Ahab's fake leg in Moby Dick.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, we haven't talked much about the Moby Dick connection, but that comes up more later in this too, correct?
Yeah.
The preview too. But yeah, it's true. That is. I hadn't thought of it in that way, but you're absolutely right. And there's like his obsession with all these kind of creation things. I love that. Yeah. There's sort of that parallel too when you look at those two stories of the two men and the women, and Hitler and Marcus. That there's an emasculation aspect to it, like the premature ejaculation versus he's a worker on a ship that needs his hands, and then he loses a hand, and he's just trying to fight through that or whatever. But it is interesting to have those run in parallel as in this whole chapter in which the danger of myths and the urge to create myth or to create something universal keeps playing itself out over and over again in this boardroom, which is kind of almost mythical in a way, where they're talking, Olaf's giving all those stories.
Yeah.
This is a really powerful chapter, and it is very meaty. And it does dance around who's speaking.
Right.
Even down
it's easy to lose track of that.
Oh, yeah.
Especially in the end, that even if someone else is speaking, it's still Thomas doing his version of them.
Recording it. Yeah. I like that ending part, which you brought up for a second there, of the man who goes into the house. That's a crazy section too, because it's hard not to read that as him, as Thomas in that instance, because he talks about his shoe covers a lot, which seemed like a very outdated thing. But the bit basically where there's a whole, it looks like more or less like a newspaper account. The man in the shoe covers keeps appearing, and he appears at this house, throws a blood sausage through the window, and in one instance, and then also goes in this house and just runs in there, grabs the chicken they're going to be cooking and eats it. And then the Tita is there, the cat, his cat, which connects him also directly with Thomas, and then exposes himself before running off. And then ends with this illusion as if that woman who was assaulted in this way was Miss Girder.
Yeah, and I think the fact that what happens as a result of this this transgression by this figure who might be Thomas or might be someone who again he's identifying with is that you get a woman being assuming and being accused of having a breakdown, right? And so this sense that what men do is read as causing psychoses for women, and then women have to bear the brunt of these, just like Katrine has to deal with the corpse that Hitler's sending her. And so it's really interesting that experience that the women in the book are having is constantly being returned to us as if to say, you've got to take account of this, right? You can't, and in something like Moby Dick, there are no women, right? There's 3 women standing, waving the ship off, and that's it. So you never have to deal with that problem. But here, you're constantly saying, we need to attend to this. And I think that's, again, that's another reason that makes it a really important book for America right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's very true.
I think Thomas can't help but find himself dealing with that. I mean, I don't think he wants to in a way. I think he'd rather be the prideful, angry man that he thinks he is and that he, aspires to be and is okay being. But then the constant movement of his mind just leads him to uncover these other more honest experiences that he would probably prefer not to.
Yeah, because he's sort of in tune with being dismissed or having little things not work out your way. Like
Yeah.
his attempts at masculinity, at that sort of posturing of masculinity and that sort of aggressiveness of masculinity tend to never work out. Like he never gets his promotion at the bank. He's not really part of the inner table at the board. He's stuck in his room in his apartment, having rented out to people who just sort of run roughshod over like what he would like to have happen. Like all of his attempts to even to be a quote unquote man's man, like even controlling the lights and trying to get the fuses out so that no one can have their lights on after 10 o'clock results in people banging in his hallway. And that makes him mad. Like there's so much little minor injustices towards him in that way. Like his masculinity doesn't work. So in a way, he's like, he becomes sort of attuned to that, like the way that this causes like insanity. It causes like just being a mess. Making the world more of a mess than it is.
Absolutely.
This part is awesome. Jesus.
I really enjoyed this book. Even like, you have those moments where you feel like you're understanding something and you enjoy that experience. And then 10 pages later, you realize you have no idea what's going on and you're completely lost, but things are happening so quickly in the prose that you're like, that's fun, that's engaging, I'm back on. I don't get what is happening, but I'm still enjoying it. And then you sit with it again and find more ground again and try to move forward. It's yeah, you could spend a lot of time with this book.
Being able to talk about it makes a huge difference with this too.
Yeah,
I have to say.
Yeah.
There's another section. One thing related to that too is like I like how he sort of shifts the line on like where the inappropriateness comes. So like there's on page 278 and 279, it starts going through his life, double life, visible and invisible. An office worker in the 12th pay grade doing harm at night. I can see the newspaper headlines. The wife of a senior official accuses a detective. The indicted, Tómas Jónsson, denies the charges. No, I will confess it all and let the state feed me in prison for a few months. And then there's this list of titles that are essentially like the allegations against him. And the first one is, woman blames man for flirting with her in public. Importunity on the streets constantly on the rise. Woman in seat number 15 at concert at the University Cinema alleges sexual assault, so we've really elevated, during performance of Bela Bartok's Sonat pour deux pianos et percussions. Fuck that all up, whatever. Government employee in 12th pay grade throws blood sausage into double-paned windows of apartment after sexual quarrel with woman at Thorblatt?
Yeah.
Winter festival in the boat shed. Are sexual matters taking over from politics in public places? This would be a worthy subject matter for the Charles Baudelaire of Iceland. Like, it goes through that sort of like ramping that up in a way, and I think that's always interesting in here too.
Yeah, and just to the word there that we paused over, Thorblatt. So it's a midwinter festival. It's a historic Icelandic thing that is referenced in the Orkney saga. So back in the 12th century. But basically, it takes its name from a historical month from the Icelandic calendar, which the Icelandic calendar sort of historically ran from sort of like mid-January to mid-February and mid-February to mid-March and stuff like that. So again, you've got this sense that like, you've got something that is historic but still has a contemporary manifestation, right? So people still celebrate it, and there's often like a meal. I don't want to quite compare it to Thanksgiving, but because it doesn't have the same purpose, but it has that sense of gathering together for food, and so again, it's like this crime that's being committed is somehow tied up in a buying into a myth in some way.
That's true.
And even before that, you have the tie it up with Bela Bartok, the idea of like art isn't salvation. Art isn't like a high culture event isn't going to mean that people there aren't awful beings who are doing awful things. That also goes back to the opera singer. Like, not that she did anything, but Hitler was attracted to her as an opera singer, and that doesn't mean that attraction is good and pure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have one last question for both of you, which was just a short section that I just wasn't sure what to make of. Either is on 277. He keeps flipping back and forth between talking about Anna and Katrine and like his bad state of being as an invalid. And then there's this one paragraph that's almost set apart that says, I sail into the fjord, convex white hills on both sides. The sea is white like a sheet at the bottom of the fjord, a blank spot. An oil barge heads towards a submarine heading under the mountain and pumps thick crude oil into its tank and reverses out. I have no idea what that is doing there. Anyone have any thoughts?
Patrick, I mean, like as a reader, like I don't want to, like throw you under the mountain here, but as a reader, was that a moment where you were just like skating over it, or?
I mean, probably.
Yep.
Considering I'm not really remembering it.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I the only initial reaction I could have is spiraling and trying to grasp at anything, and that is just that you're talking about. It's still tied into the World War II era, and that is a period when Iceland started to become much more, I don't know what's the word, industrial. I mean, the U.S. presence during and after the war led to a much more heavy industrial presence, and the thick crude oil is what jumps out at me, that I try to grasp at that connection, but that's just me spiraling.
Yeah, that's the same thing, because the oil is what throws me off, because like Iceland doesn't really do that, so it's almost like, is it being invaded in a sense from like the outside, where it's giving the oil to allow this kind of industrialization to happen?
That's what I was shooting for, but that's again just improvised on the spot under the mountain.
I feel like Lytton's about to drop some knowledge.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think for me, it's partly thinking about the sense that, like, I mean, I think that one of the purposes of Keflavik was as a refueling stop.
Okay.
So I think the oil, is coming from there. And I mean, I'm wondering if, one of the things we say in translation, especially when you're sort of first starting out, is that the most difficult thing to translate in any language are the prepositions, right? Because, you think that they should be easy, but actually that they don't, there's not a one-to-one correlation. And then, like, we use prepositions in so many different ways. And so, is there a sense that under here might mean sort of like in the shadow of? Right? Is this a way of like saying, like, so it's not literally going under the mountain, but like it's sort of imagining the Icelandic coast here and the submarines. And then so that's where one moment where you suddenly think, wow, maybe I should have gone further as a translator. There's also the fact that there's a ton of phallic imagery going on here,
yeah.
right? And
there's that.
The fact that like we've just got the fact that it's Tómas imagining himself this way. We've got to be deeply suspicious of whether he's actually seeing something, or whether he's just imagining this whole disgusting innuendo.
It does make sense, because the next thing is sucking on a cigarette, followed by him being shot with injected with whatever. I don't know what he's injected with, whatever substance.
Yep.
And then a bruise develops, so there's lots of little black on white, the thing going inside, the sort of refueling. And then to sort of wrap this up, I'll give you my favorite line of the of this section is on 278 right there. You're 79 years old today, Tómas, and headed toward 80. I'm no older than I want to be.
Right. Yep. Yep.
You have a favorite one from this one, Patrick?
Yeah, I'm trying. Well, it's favorite for a specific reason. Now I'm trying to find it. It's all the way at the beginning. Oh gosh.
Well, while Patrick's finding it,
yes,
I'll go with mine, which is I'm actually stealing two sentences from page 274. In my silence, I had the idea Ásmundur could protect his property by taking tranquilizers. You cannot spend while sleeping, you need no nourishment, you do not eat your house, and you never feel better than when sleeping in your bed. And I just think it's just a great example of like how these absurd positions end up getting logically thought through, as if like somebody could possibly consider that, well, here's the solution to the property crisis. We just all sleep through tranquilizers forever.
Seems good. Works
right? Yep. Off to find my tranquilizers.
You're gonna live forever too, I believe. Like, it's perfect. Do you find
I'm going to go with something that sums up the book, and then I'll add the reason I'm actually choosing it. The author describes with sensitive self-understanding and openness and unprudishness his mental suffering. He is an old, sick, and friendless invalid in a basement apartment of which he has been robbed. He is an invalid with shit on his ass. And that was because as I was rereading this one night to prepare for this, I reread that, and then I went and turned on the TV to watch the new episode of Rick and Morty. And in that episode, Rick pops on the screen and says, "I have shit on my ass." Tying Rich and Tómas, and also a shared 3% love of Rick and Morty. And I think you should work to drop as many Rick and Morty references into 3% posts as you can, Chad.
I've done it once.
That line. Yeah, I know. And you introduced the show to me, so it felt fitting to go with shit on my ass.
I love it. I was thinking like with the I'll put in my normal plug for Twin Peaks right here, is that when we're talking about like the hysteria and the sort of the causing of mental breakdowns or of things breaking, that's a very David Lynchian moment or idea of like where he loved it in the 90s. And with the new Twin Peaks Return series, this happens a lot too, of like investigating moments in which the world's so crazy that people just sort of scream. And at the end of last week's episode, a woman literally crawls across the ground among all these people dancing and just starts screaming. And it's kind of like this book has a bit of that sense of like things are just broken, and what do you do? What do you do? What do you do when Nazis are protesting in different places and everything's crazy like it? You just scream.
Yeah.
I'll end with one last thing. You know who started following everyone on Twitter from so usually we do our like where we are. So you can follow me at Chad W Post on Twitter and wherever, and also the open letter is open_letter. Get all the information about this thing, all that kind of stuff. But you know who started following everyone in Rochester is the Mooch.
Scaramucci follows everyone he can.
What the fuck is this? Like, I just found out like recently he's following like 60 people I know in Rochester, just one after the other, starting like 24 hours ago.
He goes through phases because like he did a like follow book Twitter for a while, and I felt sad I was left out. And then he followed me recently, and then a bunch of other people in book Twitter were like, "Oh, he followed me." So I went to his who he follows, and if you go through, you just see these weird chunks of all the certain type of people or a certain area or a certain thing being followed. He must just have like some bot thing that follows people who follow each other and then moves on. It's bizarre.
It's really bizarre.
I think he's probably just having a breakdown. I mean,
right. Well, yeah.
He's screaming. He's just screaming. And the way that we do that in the 21st century is follow people on Twitter. Lytton, where can we find you?
I'm still at Lytton J. Smith. I don't think the Mooch is following me. I'm going to try and keep it that way until next podcast.
Yeah, well, it's not going to happen. We mentioned him. It's all in the ether. You're done. And Patrick, what's yours?
PT Smith _VT.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Got it.
Another now outdated addition.
Your allegiance, it should just be _Patriots.
Fuck off.
Anyways, thanks for joining us again. Thanks for coming on. Next week, we will be talking to Tom Flynn from Volumes. He's our first return guest, I believe. And he will be covering this is the 11th book, my 12th composition book, and book 13, which sounds like a lot, but it's only pages 282 to 305. So these are 3 quick ones in succession. We'll be talking about that. And then remember that on September 30th at 3 p.m. Well, be there at 2 so you can see the First Lady of Iceland. And at 3 p.m. at Spoonville, Sugartown, we will be recording the last podcast live. So thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next week.